Grace's hands trembled as she stared at the medical report. The date made her stomach drop. 13 years ago. The patient name made her heart stop. Thomas Winters. Her ex-husband. The diagnosis was clear. Severe male factor infertility. Natural conception probability. Less than 2%. Patient advised to inform spouse immediately. He had known. For 13 years, Thomas had known he was infertile while he let Grace believe she was broken. While he put her through treatments that destroyed her body. While he blamed her for their childless marriage. While he called her defective, worthless, not a real woman. And then he divorced her at 45 to marry his pregnant secretary. But by the time Grace discovered this truth, something impossible had already happened. She was raising 4 children who called her mom. She was loved by billionaire CEO Alexander Drake, who saw her as irreplaceable. And her ex-husband was about to learn that the broken woman he discarded had become the one thing he could never destroy. This is how the cruelest lie Grace ever believed led her to a stormy night that changed 5 lives forever. How a terrified little girl's trust opened the door to a family Grace never imagined. How medical records hidden in a safe became the weapon that finally set her free. And how sometimes being rejected for all the wrong reasons leads you to exactly where you were always meant to be. If this is your first time here, welcome. I share stories of women finding unexpected joy in their second acts of life. Many viewers tell me these tales have become their Sunday afternoon ritual with a cup of tea. If you enjoy stories of healing and second chances, I'd be honored to have you join our community of wisdom seekers. But before we get to that medical file, before we get to the courtroom confrontation, before we get to the moment Alexander Drake stood between Grace and the man who tormented her for 15 years, we need to go back 6 months. Back to the afternoon Grace's world shattered. Back to 6 words that would end a marriage and begin a journey Grace never saw coming. Grace Ellington stood motionless in her kitchen, afternoon light streaming through windows that had witnessed 15 years of marriage. The fertility clinic paperwork trembled in her hands, another negative result. She'd lost count of how many times they'd tried. How many needles, how many prayers, how many tears. When Thomas walked in, his face told her everything. He wasn't coming to comfort her. Not this time. He loosened his tie, the blue one she'd given him on their 10th anniversary, his voice eerily calm. I've made a decision. I'm filing for divorce. Grace felt the room tilt. Thomas, please. We can try again. There are other options. His eyes, once warm, now looked through her as if she were already gone.
No, gracias.
You're broken. And I need a real woman. Someone who can give me children.
Broken.
The word pierced her like physical pain. 15 years of love, dismissed in a single cruel statement. He checked his watch, already moving on. The house goes on the market next week. My lawyer will contact you. I'm staying at Melissa's tonight. Melissa, his 27-year-old secretary. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The late nights, the weekend conferences, the distant eyes. Grace didn't cry.
Not then.
She stood, numb and silent, as Thomas packed his suitcase and left without looking back. The click of the front door sounded like the period at the end of a sentence. The end of a chapter. The end of everything she'd known. What Grace didn't know was that Thomas had been lying to her for over a decade. That locked in his safe was a medical report that would have changed everything. That the broken woman he was abandoning would one day hold that report in her hands and finally understand the depth of his betrayal. But that revelation was still 6 months away, and first, Grace had to learn how to survive. 3 months later, Grace pulled into Seabrook, a small coastal town where nobody knew her name or her story. She'd sold her wedding ring to pay the security deposit on a tiny 1-bedroom apartment that smelled of old paint and someone else's cooking. The Hotel Bellevue wasn't glamorous, but they needed a concierge, and Grace needed a reason to get out of bed each morning. Standing behind the polished oak desk, She wore a carefully constructed smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her colleagues were kind but distant. They sensed the invisible wall she'd built around herself. Nights were the hardest. The wind whistled through poorly sealed windows in her apartment, and the silence pressed in from all sides. Sometimes she'd stand on her small balcony, watching the waves crash against the shore, and wonder if anyone would notice if she simply disappeared into them. She kept only fragments of her former life: a photograph of her parents, long gone, a small jewelry box her grandmother had given her, and tucked away in the bottom drawer, a tiny knitted bootie, the only thing she'd allowed herself to buy during her first pregnancy, the one that ended at 11 weeks. The doctor's words still echoed in her nightmares. "I'm sorry, but there's no heartbeat." Grace survived because that's what women of her generation did. She worked.
She ate.
She slept. She repeated. But living? That had ended the day Thomas called her broken. She had no idea that in 3 months, a storm would bring a billionaire and his daughter through her hotel doors. That a little girl's trust would crack open the frozen parts of her heart. That the words, "Come with me," would offer her a second chance she never thought she deserved. But tonight, there was only silence and the endless crash of waves and the weight of being alone. The storm had been raging for hours, sheets of rain lashing against the hotel windows, when Grace's shift should have ended. But Marnie, the night concierge, was stranded by flooded roads, so Grace stayed on, watching raindrops race down glass panes and listening to thunder roll across the sky. At 11:42 p.m., the front doors burst open. A tall man in a soaked charcoal suit stumbled in, cradling someone in his arms. A child. A little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with dark curls plastered to her tear-streaked face. The man's voice was strained, urgent. "I need a room. Our driver lost control on the highway. The car's in a ditch about a mile back. My daughter's terrified, and my phone's dead." Grace moved quickly, fingers flying over the keyboard. "Of course, sir. Are either of you hurt? Should I call for medical assistance?" "No, just shaken." Emily's scared of storms. As if on cue, thunder boomed overhead, and the little girl let out a wail, burying her face deeper into her father's neck. Grace handed him the room key and a towel from the stack they kept for pool guests. "Room 412. It's our quietest room, away from the storm side." The man nodded gratefully. But as he turned toward the elevator, little Emily suddenly looked up, her wide brown eyes locking onto Grace. Without warning, the child squirmed out of her father's arms and ran straight to Grace, arms outstretched. Emily wrapped her small arms around Grace's legs, her little body still trembling. She looked up with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "Are you an angel? You look like the angel in my book." Grace felt something crack inside her, some frozen part beginning to thaw. Kneeling down to the child's level, she smiled, a real smile this time, not the professional mask she'd worn for months. "I'm not an angel, sweetie. Just Grace." She gently tucked a wet curl behind Emily's ear. "But I think you're very brave to have walked all that way in this scary storm." Emily's face brightened slightly. "Daddy carried me most of the way. He's the strongest daddy in the world." Grace looked up to find the father watching them with an expression of astonishment. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The storm, the hotel, the weight of the past. He was handsome, certainly, but it wasn't his looks that struck her. It was the naked vulnerability on his face, so at odds with his powerful presence. "I'm Alexander Drake," he said quietly. "And apparently, my daughter has excellent judgment in people." The name registered dimly in Grace's mind. Alexander Drake, the famously private CEO of Drake Technologies. His face occasionally graced business magazines, always with headlines about his innovative leadership or philanthropic efforts. What Grace remembered most, though, was a brief mention of tragedy, his wife's death during childbirth several years ago. Alexander's voice was barely audible over the storm. Emily hasn't approached anyone like this since her mother died. Grace felt the weight of his words. The trust of a child who had lost her mother, reaching for her. It felt sacred somehow, and terrifying. "Would you like some hot chocolate, Emily?" Grace asked gently. "I have a special recipe that helps chase away storm fears." Emily nodded eagerly, her tears forgotten. Alexander seemed about to object. It was late, after all. But something stopped him. Instead, he watched as Grace led them to the small staff kitchenette, where she warmed milk and stirred in cocoa powder, cinnamon, and a tiny drop of vanilla. As Emily sipped her chocolate, her eyelids grew heavy. Alexander carried her to their room, but at the door, Emily insisted on a hug from Grace. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked sleepily. "Yes," Grace promised. "I'll be right here at the desk." As Alexander carried his now sleeping daughter into their room, he turned back. "Thank you for seeing her, really seeing her." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Long after they'd gone, she stood in the empty lobby, feeling the first flicker of something she thought had died forever. Hope. Like a tiny, fragile flame that might be extinguished by the slightest breath, but burning nonetheless. What Grace didn't know was that upstairs, Alexander Drake sat beside his sleeping daughter, unable to stop thinking about the quiet concierge with sad eyes and a gentle smile. That he'd already made a decision that would seem insane to everyone but him. That in the morning, he would offer Grace something that would change both their lives forever. But for now, there was just the storm and the sleeping child and two people who didn't yet know they were exactly what the other needed. Grace arrived early for her shift the next morning, her sleep having been fitful and filled with dreams she couldn't quite remember. The storm had passed, leaving behind a wash-clean sky and puddles that reflected perfect blue. She wasn't expecting to see Alexander Drake waiting in the lobby, dressed in a fresh suit that must have been delivered overnight. But there he was, sitting in one of the leather armchairs, checking his watch. "Mr. Drake," she said, professional mask sliding back into place. "I hope you and Emily were comfortable last night." He stood, something unreadable flickering across his face. "We were, thank you. Emily's having breakfast in the restaurant with my assistant." I asked her to watch Emily for a moment because he hesitated, uncharacteristic for a man known for his decisive leadership, because I wanted to speak with you privately. Grace's stomach tightened. Had she overstepped last night? Perhaps he was here to complain about her unprofessional behavior. "Of course," she said, gesturing to a quiet corner of the lobby. "How can I help?" Alexander didn't sit. He stood looking at her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but somehow she couldn't. "Last night was the first time I've seen my daughter connect with anyone since her mother died," he said quietly. 3 years of nannies, teachers, friends' mothers, all wonderful people, but Emily has kept everyone at arm's length. Until you. Grace didn't know what to say. "Children have good instincts," she offered finally. "Yes, they do." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a surprisingly human gesture from someone whose public image was so controlled. "I need to tell you something, and I hope you won't think I'm completely insane." She waited, heart beating faster than it should. "I have 3 other children besides Emily," he continued. "Max is 12, Sophie is 10, and Liam is 8. They're my wife's sister's children. She and her husband died in a car accident last year, and I became their guardian. They're wonderful kids, but they're—" He searched for the right word. "Wounded. Just like Emily. Just like me." Grace listened, wondering where this was leading. "Our home is beautiful, but it's not a home, not really. It's just a place where 5 broken people try to avoid cracking further." His eyes never left her face. "And then last night, I watched you with Emily, and I saw something I haven't seen in my daughter's eyes for years. Trust. Comfort. Connection." He took a deep breath. "I'm not offering you a job, Grace. God knows I've tried that route. Nannies, housekeepers, tutors. None of it works because that's not what we need. What do you need? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Healing, he said simply. And for reasons I don't understand, Emily saw something in you that made her feel safe. I haven't felt hope like that in years. Alexander took a step closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something woodsy and subtle. Come with me, Grace. Not as an employee, as someone my daughter trusts, and someone I can't stop thinking about. The world seemed to stop. Grace stared at him, certain she'd misheard. Mr. Drake, you don't know me. I know enough. His voice was gentle but firm. I know you have kind eyes that carry too much sadness. I know you make hot chocolate at midnight for frightened little girls. I know my daughter slept through the night for the first time in months after meeting you. Grace felt dizzy. This is impossible. You can't just invite a stranger into your life, into your children's lives, based on one interaction. Can't I? The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. I've built a billion-dollar company by trusting my instincts. And every instinct I have is screaming that you belong with us. Why? Grace whispered, fighting tears. What could I possibly offer you or your family? Alexander's expression softened. Safety.
Care.
Understanding. Things money can't buy. He paused. I'm not proposing marriage, Grace.
I'm proposing possibility.
Come stay in our guest house. Meet the children. If it doesn't feel right, I'll have my driver bring you back here with no questions asked. It was madness. Complete madness. And yet, I have nothing to offer, Grace said again, her voice breaking. I'm broken, Mr. Drake. Something flashed in his eyes, anger, but not at her.
Who told you that?
Grace looked away. Everyone. No one. Alexander gently, so gently, touched her hand, the briefest contact. Then, everyone is wrong. He stepped back, giving her space. Emily is finishing breakfast. We're heading home in an hour. If you want to come with us, even just to see, I'll have a car waiting. He turned to leave, then stopped. And Grace?
I'm Alexander.
Not Mr. Drake. What Grace didn't know was that this moment, this impossible invitation, would lead her to a family that would heal her broken places, that it would lead her to a love deeper than she'd ever imagined. But it would also lead her ex-husband to her doorstep, armed with cruelty and lies. It would lead to tabloid headlines and whispered gossip. It would lead to a confrontation that would force Grace to finally fight back. And it would lead to a folder of medical records that would reveal the truth Thomas had hidden for 13 years. But all of that was still ahead. Right now, there was just a choice: stay safe in her small, lonely life, or walk through the door this stranger had opened. Grace took a deep breath. I'll get my things. The Drake estate sprawled across 10 acres of landscape grounds, the main house a modernist structure of glass and stone that should have felt cold, but somehow didn't. As the car pulled through wrought iron gates, Grace felt her courage faltering. What was she doing here? Emily, however, had no such reservations. She'd spent the 40-minute drive chattering about her room, her toys, and most importantly, her siblings. Max doesn't talk much, but he's teaching me chess, she explained seriously. Sophie draws all the time. And Liam's really good at climbing trees, even though he's not supposed to. Alexander had remained quiet, watching Grace in the rearview mirror as Emily continued her familial introductions. Mrs. Chun is our housekeeper. She makes the best cookies, but doesn't smile very much. And Rosa helps with cleaning and laundry. Now, as they approached the house, Grace could see 3 children watching from a large window. One tall boy with a guarded expression, a girl with a long braid, and a smaller boy who was obviously Liam, bouncing slightly with curiosity. They're suspicious of everyone, Alexander said quietly as he parked. Don't take it personally. The introductions were awkward, as expected. Max, the oldest at 12, offered a stiff handshake and monosyllabic responses. Sophie, 10, assessed Grace with artist's eyes, taking in details. 8-year-old Liam circled her like a dubious satellite, maintaining careful distance. Only Emily seemed delighted, pulling Grace by the hand to show her the guest house, a charming stone cottage nestled among oak trees, a short walk from the main house. "This is yours," Alexander explained, setting down her suitcase. "Your space whenever you need it.
No expectations.
No pressure." The cottage was beautiful, one bedroom, a small kitchen, a living area with bookshelves, and windows that overlooked a garden. It felt like something from a dream. "Why are you doing this?" Grace asked when Emily had run outside to chase a butterfly. Alexander looked at her steadily. "Because I recognize what it looks like when someone is drowning. Because my children deserve more than survival. Because something tells me you belong here." He moved toward the door. "Dinner's at 6.
Come if you want to.
Or don't. This isn't a prison, Grace." Left alone, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed. This morning, she'd been a hotel concierge with an empty apartment and emptier future. Now she was, what, exactly? Not a nanny. Not a housekeeper. Not a girlfriend or partner. Just here. She unpacked slowly, hanging her few clothes in the cedar closet. When she was finished, she opened the cottage door and stepped outside. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, and somewhere, a bird was singing. For the first time in months, Grace took a deep breath that didn't hurt. Dinner that first night was tense. The children watched her covertly, passing silent messages with their eyes. Alexander attempted conversation, but it fell flat against the wall of childish suspicion. "Why are you here?" Max finally asked bluntly, setting down his fork. Alexander started to intervene, but Grace shook her head slightly. "I'm not entirely sure," she answered honestly. "Your father invited me because Emily and I connected. I came because—" She hesitated. "Because sometimes life offers you an unexpected door, and you have to decide whether to walk through it. Are you going to be our new mom?" Sophie asked, her voice carefully neutral. "No," Grace said firmly. "No one could replace your mother or your aunt. I'm just a friend. Someone who might be part of your life for a while." "That's what the others said too," Leah muttered. "They all left." Grace nodded, understanding. "People do leave sometimes. I can't promise I'll stay forever, but I can promise I won't disappear without saying goodbye." It wasn't much, but it was honest. The children seemed to sense that, and the atmosphere shifted slightly, not friendly yet, but less hostile. What none of them knew was that Grace's honesty would become the foundation of trust. That her promise not to disappear would be tested when her ex-husband tried to drive her away. That these 4 wounded children would teach Grace that family isn't about biology, it's about showing up day after day, even when it's hard. But tonight, it was just dinner and careful words and the first tentative steps toward something that might, someday, become a family. Days turned into weeks. Grace found her place slowly, carefully. She didn't try to mother the children. They had memories of their mother and aunt that deserved preservation. Instead, she simply existed alongside them, available but not intrusive. She discovered Max's passion for astronomy and ordered a more powerful telescope. She sat quietly while Sophie sketched, offering praise only when genuinely moved by the girl's talent. She taught Liam to make paper airplanes that flew farther than anyone else's. And with Emily, she planted a small garden outside the cottage, flowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. Mornings developed a rhythm. Grace would wake early, walk to the main house, and start coffee brewing. Alexander would appear, already dressed for work, but willing to linger over breakfast. The children would trickle in, Max first, then Sophie, Liam, and finally Emily, hair tousled from sleep. No one commented on this new routine, this gentle domesticity. It simply evolved like water finding its natural course. One night, a thunderstorm woke Grace. Lightning illuminated the cottage in stark flashes, and she thought of Emily, terrified of storms. Without thinking, She pulled on a robe and hurried through the rain to the main house. She found Emily curled in a ball beneath her covers, whimpering with each thunderclap. Sitting gently on the edge of the bed, Grace stroked the little girl's hair. "It's just the clouds having a conversation," she whispered. "They have big, booming voices because they're so high up." Emily peeked out, tear-streaked face illuminated by a night light. "Really? Really? And the lightning is just them taking pictures like flashbulbs." Gradually, Emily relaxed, her breathing slowing as she drifted back to sleep. When Grace turned to leave, she found Alexander in the doorway, watching them with an expression that made her heart skip. "Thank you," he mouthed silently. Grace nodded, suddenly aware of her thin nightgown beneath her robe, of her bare feet, of the intimacy of the moment. As she passed him in the doorway, his hand caught hers, warm, strong. "Stay," he whispered. "In the house. The storm's too heavy." There was nothing improper in the invitation, yet Grace felt her cheeks warm. "I should go back," she said softly. Alexander's thumb traced a small circle on her wrist, sending shivers up her arm. "The guest room, then. Please." Something in his eyes made argument impossible. Grace nodded, and he led her to a room down the hall, his hand never leaving hers until they reached the door. "Good night, Grace," he said, his voice husky in the darkness. "Good night, Alexander." Later, lying in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the storm, Grace realized the house didn't feel unfamiliar at all anymore. It felt like something she'd never expected to find again. It felt like home. 3 months into Grace's stay, the household had transformed. Laughter echoed through rooms that had once been silent. Mrs. Chun, the housekeeper, actually smiled now. The children gravitated toward Grace naturally, for homework help, for comfort after minor injuries, for company on walks through the woods behind the property. Alexander watched it all with quiet wonder. Sometimes Grace would look up to find his eyes on her, something unspoken in their depths that made her breath catch. They never discussed her leaving. The guest cottage had become undeniably hers, bookshelves filled with novels she loved, vases of fresh flowers on tables, a throw blanket draped over the sofa. She'd started volunteering at the local library's children's program 3 mornings a week, reading stories to preschoolers while the Drake children were at school. Grace was sitting on the cottage porch one autumn afternoon, a mug of tea warming her hands, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her press the green button. "Hello." "I knew it was you." Thomas's voice, slick with accusation. Living in the lap of luxury with Alexander Drake. Grace's blood turned to ice. "Thomas? How did you?" "Oh, it wasn't hard. Small towns talk. Especially when the resident billionaire suddenly has a mysterious woman living on his property." His laugh was ugly. "You certainly landed on your feet, didn't you? From worthless wife to billionaire's whore." "Don't call here again," Grace said, her voice shaking as she ended the call. But the damage was done. The peace she'd built over months shattered like glass. How had Thomas found her? What did he want? That evening, she couldn't hide her distress. Alexander found her in the kitchen, staring blankly at a pot of pasta water that had long since boiled away. "Grace." His hand on her shoulder made her jump. "What's wrong?" She couldn't meet his eyes. "My ex-husband called today. Somehow, he found out I'm here. With you." Alexander's expression darkened. "What did he want? To hurt me?" She finally looked up at him. "That's all he's ever wanted since I couldn't give him a child." Without hesitation, Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest. Grace could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean into his strength. "He can't touch you here," Alexander murmured against her hair. "You're safe." Grace pulled back slightly. "But the children aren't. What if he starts spreading rumors? They've been through enough trauma without adding gossip and scandal." Alexander cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. You are not responsible for the actions of a bitter, cruel man. You've brought life back to this house, joy back to my children. I won't let him take that away. But Thomas's call was only the beginning. The next day, Grace received an email with a link to a tabloid article. Drake CEO's mystery woman, gold digger or homewrecker? There was a grainy photo of her walking with Emily in the local park and quotes from sources close to the family claiming she had deliberately targeted a vulnerable widower. More calls followed. More emails. A letter delivered to the main house, filled with threats and accusations. Grace began to jump at shadows, to check over her shoulder whenever she took the children to town. Alexander was furious. He called his security team his lawyers. But legal threats couldn't stop the whispers, the sideways glances when Grace accompanied the children to school events. What Grace didn't know was that Alexander's head of security was already digging into Thomas's past. That locked in a storage unit 3 states away was a folder Thomas had hidden 13 years ago. That the truth about Grace's infertility was about to come to light. But that discovery was still weeks away, and first, Grace would have to face Thomas one more time. Over the next weeks, with Alexander's support, Grace fought back. She met with his lawyers, providing evidence of Thomas's harassment. She documented every call, every email. And when Thomas showed up at a school event, drunk and belligerent, security removed him while Alexander stood protectively beside Grace, his hand steady at the small of her back. The final confrontation came on a chilly November evening. Grace was helping Emily with a school project when the doorbell rang. Mrs. Chin answered it, then came to the craft room, her face pale. "Miss Grace, there's a man at the door. He says he's your husband." Grace's heart stopped. "Ex-husband," she corrected automatically, setting down the glue stick. "Emily, stay here with Mrs. Chun, okay? I need to talk to someone." In the foyer, Thomas stood smirking, looking out of place against the elegant backdrop. He'd aged in the past year, his face puffy, his once trim physique softened by too much alcohol. "There she is," he drawled, "playing house with someone else's children. Ironic, isn't it?" Grace forced herself to stand straight. "You need to leave, Thomas."
Now.
"Or what?" He stepped closer, alcohol heavy on his breath. "You'll call your billionaire boyfriend? Is that what it took, Grace? Money? If I'd known you were such a whore, I'd have just paid for a surrogate instead of wasting 15 years on you. Get out." Alexander's voice, cold and dangerous, came from behind Grace. He moved to stand beside her, not in front of her, supporting, not shielding. "Get out of my house before I have you thrown out." Thomas laughed. "Oh, the hero arrives. Tell me, Drake, did she tell you she can't have children? That she's defective? Or were you just looking for a live-in nanny who'd warm your bed?" Grace felt something snap inside her, not in fear or pain, but in anger. Pure, cleansing rage that burned away the last of her shame. "I am not defective," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I am not broken. And I am not your wife anymore. Thank God." She stepped forward, forcing Thomas to back up. "You lied to me for years. You cheated. You manipulated. And when I couldn't give you what you wanted, you threw me away like garbage." Another step. But I survived. I found a place where I'm valued for who I am, not what my body can or can't do. Thomas's face twisted. "You think he loves you? You're nothing but a charity case. A poor, barren." Finish that sentence, and you'll regret it. Alexander's voice was soft but lethal. "My security team is already on their way. You have 2 choices. Leave now and never contact Grace again, or be arrested for trespassing and harassment." Something in Alexander's expression must have penetrated Thomas's alcohol-fogged brain, because he backed toward the door. "This isn't over," he threatened. "Yes," Grace said firmly. "It is." After Thomas was escorted off the property by security, Grace stood trembling in the foyer, adrenaline draining away to leave her exhausted. You are magnificent, Alexander said quietly. Grace shook her head. I was terrified. The two aren't mutually exclusive. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch featherlight. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. Later, after the children were asleep, Alexander came to Grace's cottage. She opened the door to find him holding a thick folder. What's this? She asked, inviting him in. Evidence. He set it on her coffee table. Bank records showing Thomas emptied your joint accounts before filing for divorce. Medical records confirming that his sperm count and motility were the likely cause of your fertility issues, not anything wrong with you. Affidavits from former colleagues about his affairs. Grace stared at the folder. How did you get all this? Alexander's smile was grim. Money has its advantages. I have very good lawyers and even better investigators. Why? Because you deserve to know the truth. Because he hurt you with lies. And because he hesitated, then continued more softly, because I couldn't bear to see you doubt your worth for one more day. Grace opened the folder with shaking hands, scanning documents that rewrote her understanding of her marriage, her divorce, her very self. He knew, she whispered, looking up at Alexander with shock. He knew all along that he was the one with fertility issues. The doctor told him 3 years into our marriage. Alexander nodded. And he let you believe it was your fault. Let you endure treatments you didn't need. Why would he do that? Because admitting the truth would have damaged his ego, his self-image as the perfect man. Alexander sat beside her on the sofa. Some men's egos are very fragile things. Grace leaned back, processing. What do I do with this information? Whatever you want. Use it in court if he continues to harass you. Tell the world. Tell no one. Alexander's hand found hers. The power is yours now. That night, after Alexander left, Grace stood on her cottage porch, looking up at the stars. For the first time in years, she felt truly free, not because Thomas's power over her was broken, though it was, but because she finally understood that her value had never been tied to her fertility. That being loved wasn't conditional on what her body could produce. In the main house, a light still burned in Alexander's study. Grace smiled, knowing he was waiting up, watching over her and the children, their unlikely family cobbled together from broken pieces to form something stronger and more beautiful than before. What Grace didn't know was that tomorrow morning, Alexander would ask her a question that would change everything. That the truth about Thomas would become the catalyst for Grace to finally choose her own happiness. That in 48 hours, she would stand in a courtroom and claim the justice she deserved. But tonight, there was just the stars, and the knowledge that she was no longer alone, and the understanding that sometimes the cruelest lies lead us to the most beautiful truths. Winter settled over the Drake estate, transforming it into a snow globe world of white-dusted pine trees and frozen ponds. Inside, the house grew warmer, not just from the crackling fireplaces, but from the connection strengthening between its inhabitants. The trust came in small moments, precious as pearls on a string. Max, serious beyond his 12 years, began seeking her out in the evenings. One night, he led her to a dusty corner of the sprawling attic, where a trunk sat unopened. It was my mom's, he explained. Dad doesn't come up here. Together, they opened it. Inside were journals, photo albums, and a collection of classic children's books, all well-loved. She used to read to us every night, Max said, his voice carefully neutral, even when she was really sick. Grace touched the books gently. She had excellent taste. Would you? Max stopped, swallowed. Would you read them to Emily? She doesn't remember Mom's voice. Grace felt her throat tighten. I'd be honored, but only if you'll join us sometimes. These stories are meant to be shared. By the 5th night of reading together, Alexander stood in the doorway, listening with a soft smile as all 4 children gathered for the nightly ritual. Sophie's trust came through art. The 10-year-old had talent that surpassed her years. One morning, she silently handed Grace a portrait, Grace reading to Emily, their profiles caught in perfect detail. "This is beautiful," Grace breathed. "You've captured Emily perfectly." Sophie shook her head.
No.
"I captured you. The way you look at her. At all of us." Grace didn't know what to say. "How do I look at you?" Sophie considered, head tilted. "Like we're real. Like you see us, not just what happened to us." Liam's trust was earned in mud puddles and climbing trees. The 8-year-old tested boundaries constantly, watching to see if Grace would break under pressure or disappear when things got difficult. One day, after rescuing him from a too-high climb in the old oak tree, Liam looked at Grace with serious eyes. "My mom died because her heart was sick. And my dad died in the accident because he was sad about Mom and wasn't paying attention to the road. Are you going to die too?" The question knocked the breath from Grace's lungs. "Oh, Liam, I can't promise I'll never die. Everyone does eventually. But I promise I'm healthy and I'm very, very careful when I drive." Liam nodded, processing this. "Okay, but if you do die, say goodbye first. Don't just disappear." The next day, Liam presented her with a handmade friendship bracelet. "If you wear it, it means you're family." Grace let him tie it around her wrist, blinking back tears. "I'll never take it off," she promised. Emily's trust had been instant and complete from the beginning, but it deepened with daily rituals, braiding her hair before school, nighttime prayers, butterfly hunts in the greenhouse Alexander had built when the first snow fell. "Daddy says you make him smile again," Emily confided one evening as Grace tucked her in. "He said his heart was frozen, but you made it warm." Grace smoothed the little girl's curls. "Your daddy makes me smile too." Emily yawned, eyes drifting closed. "Are you going to be my mommy someday?" The question lingered in the air even after Emily had fallen asleep. Grace sat there, watching the child's peaceful face, afraid to examine her own hopes too closely. "She asks me the same question." Grace turned to find Alexander in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his expression soft in the glow of Emily's nightlight. "I never know what to tell her," Grace admitted. Alexander crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside her. "What do you want to tell her?" Grace's heart hammered. "That's not a fair question." "No," he agreed, "but it's an honest one." The weeks passed in a blur of holiday preparations. Grace threw herself into Christmas planning, determined to make it magical for the children. She baked cookies, hung stockings, wrapped presents late into the night. At the children's holiday concert, they sat together in the front row, Alexander, Grace, and Emily between them. When Max took the stage for his solo in the middle school choir, Alexander reached for Grace's hand. She laced her fingers through his, feeling the rightness of it. Later, at the reception, a teacher approached them. "Mr. and Mrs. Drake, Max was wonderful tonight." Before either could correct her, Liam piped up. "She's not Mrs. Drake yet, but we're working on it." Grace felt her face flame, but Alexander just laughed, his arms sliding around her waist. "We certainly are," he agreed, dropping a kiss on top of Grace's head as naturally as if he'd been doing it for years. That night, after the children were asleep, Alexander walked Grace to her cottage as usual. At the door, he turned to her, his eyes dark in the porch light. "Grace," he said, his voice rough, "I'm trying to be patient, to give you time. But tonight, seeing you with the children, being together as a family," he trailed off, then started again. "I'm falling in love with you. I think I have been since the night you made hot chocolate for Emily during the storm." Before she could respond, he bent and brushed his lips against hers, the lightest touch, a question more than a demand. Then he was gone, walking back through the snow to the main house, leaving Grace with her fingers pressed to her lips and her heart pounding in her chest. Inside her cottage, she moved as if in a dream, touching the bracelet Liam had made her, the drawings Sophie had given her, the shell Emily had found during their last beach trip. On her bedside table sat a book of poetry Max had shyly recommended. These weren't just gifts. They were pieces of trust, of connection, of family. Grace looked out her window toward the main house, where a light still burned in Alexander's study. The man who had opened his home and heart to her, who saw her not as broken, but as essential. For the first time since Thomas had shattered her world, Grace allowed herself to imagine a future filled not just with contentment or peace, but with joy, with love. She wasn't ready to say the words aloud yet, but as she got ready for bed, she knew with sudden clarity that she would be.
Soon.
Spring arrived in a blaze of glory, transforming the Drake estate into a paradise of blooming roses and children's laughter. 6 months had passed since Thomas's confrontation, and life had settled into a rhythm of contentment that still sometimes took Grace's breath away. The mother-son dance had been a turning point. Max, solemn in his first suit, had stood at the bottom of the staircase, waiting for Grace to descend. When she appeared in a midnight blue gown, a simple strand of pearls at her throat, his eyes had widened. "You look beautiful," he'd said, his voice cracking slightly. "And you're very handsome," she'd replied, straightening his tie. At the dance, during a break by the refreshment table, a teacher had approached them. "It's wonderful to see Max here. He's mentioned that things have been changing at home. All good changes, it seems."
Moksh had straightened proudly.
"This is my mom," he'd said, the word rolling off his tongue as if he'd been saying it his whole life. Later, driving home, Max had been quiet until they turned onto the estate's winding driveway. "I remember my first mom," he'd said suddenly. "And I remember Aunt Claire. I was afraid I'd forget them if I loved someone new." Grace had waited, giving him space to continue. "But Dad said that hearts are weird, they don't run out of room. They just keep growing." He looked at her then, his young face serious in the dashboard lights. "I think mine grew enough for you, too." 2 weeks later, Grace stood in a courtroom, Alexander beside her, as the judge delivered her final ruling on the case against Thomas. The judge's words rang clear. "The court finds that Mr. Winters deliberately concealed assets during the divorce proceedings and maliciously withheld medical information that would have affected the outcome." When it was over, Thomas tried to approach them, but security intervened. "You think you've won," he called as they left the courtroom. "But we both know what you are." Grace paused, turning to face the man who had once been the center of her world. "Yes," she said calmly. "We do know what I am. I am strong. I am worthy. I am loved." She smiled at Alexander. "And I am finally completely free of you." Outside, sunshine washed over them. Alexander pulled Grace close. "You were magnificent in there." She shook her head. "I was terrified." "The two aren't mutually exclusive," he reminded her. "Are you ready to go home? The children are waiting."
Home.
Children waiting. The simple beauty of these words brought tears to Grace's eyes. "Yes," she said, squeezing his hand. "Let's go home." That night, after the children were asleep, Alexander led Grace to the cottage, now strung with fairy lights and filled with roses. Inside, a small table was set for two, champagne chilling in an ice bucket. "What is all this?" she whispered. Alexander drew her fully into the room. "This is the beginning of the cottage's new purpose." "Which is?" His smile was tender as he led her to the table. "A place for us. Just us. Where we can escape sometimes, remember how this all began, be Alexander and Grace instead of Mom and Dad." Alexander reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Grace's breath caught. "When Emily was born," he said quietly, "I thought I knew what love was. When I lost Diana, I thought I knew what grief was. When I adopted my sister's children, I thought I knew what family was." He opened the box, revealing a stunning emerald ring surrounded by diamonds. "But then you walked into our lives, and everything I thought I knew was rewritten." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hand. "Grace Ellington, I love you. The children love you. We are already a family in every way that matters, but I want to make it official, not just for the world, but for us. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it. To you, to the children, to this life we've built." Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to kiss her, a kiss that promised forever, that sealed the journey from brokenness to wholeness. 3 months later, Grace stood barefoot in the garden of their home, surrounded by Alexander and the children. Simple vows replaced grand gestures, promises to love, to respect, to cherish each other through whatever life might bring. Family isn't about perfection, the officiant said, looking at the assembled group. It's about belonging, about seeing each other's broken places and loving more deeply because of them. As Alexander slipped a gold band onto Grace's finger to join her engagement ring, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the day Thomas had called her broken, to this moment of profound wholeness. Under string lights and the golden glow of sunset, Grace looked at the faces of her family, Alexander, her husband, Max, Sophie, Liam, and Emily, her children in every way that mattered. She wasn't infertile. She wasn't broken. She was irreplaceable, essential,
Loved.
and sometimes, when life closes a door with cruel finality, it opens not just a window, but an entire garden gate, leading to a place more beautiful than we ever dared imagine. Thank you for joining me for Grace's journey from heartbreak to healing. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more tales that remind us of the power of second chances and unconditional love. Remember, your story isn't over. Sometimes the most beautiful chapter is the one you haven't read yet.